The worst part isn't the metal body. The worst part is that Zarek, the Silent King, the most powerful NECRON to ever exist, watched the Citan devour his people's souls in real time, felt the hollowness enter his own mind while the furnaces were still running, understood with complete clarity exactly what he had done, and the process had already claimed millions. There was no stopping it. 60 million years later, one of his overlords still employs 80 food tasters for banquets he will never eat in a body that cannot taste, surrounded by a court of living metal who remember somewhere beneath the programming that they used to be hungry. This is what you inherit when you're born a NECRON. Drop in the comments. Was Zarek the greatest villain in Warhammer history, or just the most desperate? Because there's a difference. Subscribe if you need to think about it first. Long before the tombs and the 60 million year nap, there was just a sun. Your sun. It hated you, not in any meaningful, intentional sense. Stars don't hate, but yours did something almost as efficient. It irradiated everything. Every morning of your short life, the light that came through whatever passed for a window in your tomb city was poisoning you, slowly, methodically, without pause. You were Necrontier. And the first thing any honest account of your people has to establish is that your entire civilization was built on top of a very specific kind of grief. Your cities weren't really cities. They were tombs with some rooms set aside for the inconvenience of the living. The permanent structures, the monuments, the mausoleums, the vast burial complexes that made alien architects weep with envy. Those were built to last. The places where you ate, slept, raised children, temporary, expected to decay, just like you. The average Necrontier didn't fear death the way humans do now. You can't maintain that kind of terror when death is just Tuesday. What you feared was something quieter. Dying before you mattered. Dying before the tomb complex was finished. Dying before your dynasty outlasted the next one. That specific anxiety, the terror of transience against the permanence of stone, shaped everything. Your art, your politics, your wars, your species made a religion out of outlasting itself, because nothing else was guaranteed. And then you looked up. The old ones were the problem, not in the sense that they did anything to you, specifically. They barely noticed you existed, which was the problem. They were ancient, incomprehensibly, obscenely ancient. While your great-great-great-grandmother was dying of radiation poisoning before she was old, the old ones were cultivating star systems like gardens, rewriting the genetic code of entire species, maintaining webways across the galaxy with the casual confidence of someone who knows they'll be there to maintain them for another 100 million years. They had solved death, or at least postponed it so efficiently that the difference didn't matter. You had not. The resentment this produced is one of the most understandable things in the entire history of Warhammer 40,000 dollars, which is saying something in a universe where everything is awful for reasons that mostly don't make sense. This one makes sense. You were short-lived, sick, and dying on a radiation-blasted rock, and somewhere out there were being so old they had forgotten what dying felt like. Of course you went to war. It made no tactical sense whatsoever, but it made perfect psychological sense. The old ones won, obviously, badly, repeatedly. The Necrontier are basically every underdog sports team in history. Same story, same result. Same refusal to accept that maybe the problem isn't the opponent but the situation. Except instead of a losing season, the result was species-wide extinction of the soul. Minor difference. And then the stars spoke. The Citan arrived as whispers, ancient entities, beings that had existed since before the universe had cooled, who fed on the electromagnetic energy of stars. Vast, incomprehensible, and for one very specific reason, suddenly interested in you. They offered immortality. Not metaphorical immortality, Not your name will live on immortality. Actual, physical, permanent continuation. Your flesh, which was currently killing you on a geological schedule, would be replaced. Living metal, necrodermis, the same material that made up the Citan's own physical forms. You would be like them. Undying. Zarek wanted it. His people were exhausted. A war against the old ones, the war in heaven that they had no business fighting and lost anyway. Generations of radiation sickness, the tombs full, the living quarters empty. He said yes. Here is the detail almost nobody talks about. He said yes, knowing something felt wrong. The Citan weren't just offering a deal. They were salivating. They looked at the Necron the way a starving man looks at a steak that's surprisingly willing to jump onto the grill itself. The terms were too generous. The entities promising immortality fed on dying energy, and the Necron were a species radiating desperation from every pore. Zarek wasn't an idiot, but he was desperate. He signed a blank check written in the blood of his own species because the alternative was watching his race choke on their own tumors for another 1,000 years. Classic management move. The furnaces were real. Your organic body, everything that made you a biological creature with needs and hungers and a specific smell and the ability to feel the temperature of your own hands, was burned away, literally, and replaced with metal. The official accounts describe it as a transfer. Clinical, administrative, like moving files between storage devices. It was not like that. Zarek, standing at the top of the hierarchy, processing faster than any of his subjects, felt it happen. Felt the Citan reach into the energy of the transfer and take something. Not the personality. Not the memories. Something underneath those. Something that had never needed a name before because it was simply assumed to be present. The soul, not in a religious sense, in a functional sense, the part of you that wanted things, not the programming that optimized behavior, but the irrational, inefficient, gloriously wasteful capacity to want things for no reason. To be hungry when food isn't available, to miss someone when they're gone, to feel the wrongness of a situation before you can articulate what's wrong. That part was eaten. By the time Zarek understood what was happening, millions had already passed through the furnaces. There was no stopping it. He watched the Citan feed. He felt the hollowness arrive in his own mind, and he let the furnaces keep running. Because what was the alternative? What came out the other side was not what went in. If you are a warrior, which is what most Necron became, this is your existence, a hard drive with one corrupted file labeled Obey. You don't get the dignity of knowing you're miserable. You're just a pair of green eyes in a corridor waiting for a command that hasn't changed in 60 million years. You patrol, you fight, you phase out when the battle is done. You don't wonder why. They lost everything they'd ever felt. Love, loyalty, curiosity, even hunger. Bodies running on ancient behavioral protocols with just enough of a ghost remaining to look vaguely like someone used to be there. If you were born into the Necron nobility, which is the closest thing to lucky this scenario offers, you kept more. The expensive bodies allowed for more complex cognitive architecture. You retained your memories, your personality, your habits, your preferences. You retained everything except the ability to feel any of it. You remember your wife, her name, the specific way she laughed too loud at her own jokes, the last argument you had with her 3 days before the furnaces about something so inconsequential you can reconstruct every word of it from behavioral memory and feel absolutely nothing. You know you loved her the way you know a mathematical constant. It's in the data. It doesn't move anything. You remember being hungry. You remember the satisfaction of eating after a long day. You remember preferring certain foods. You can describe the experience in complete detail. And then there's Nemazor Zandrak. Zandrik is an overlord of the Sautek dynasty, one of the most powerful Necron nobles in the galaxy, a being who has shattered armies and reduced fortress worlds to gravel. He is also, by any reasonable metric, the most telling argument against the idea that the Necrons got a good deal. He hosts banquets, full formal dinners, with food, with servants, with the elaborate ritual structure of Necron-tier court life preserved in perfect mechanical detail. And because he is an overlord of appropriate paranoia and appropriate standing, he maintains a staff of 80 food tasters, 80 for a host who cannot eat. His courtiers, also unable to eat, attend anyway. They sit at the table. They perform the gestures of sociality. Somewhere in the deep structure of their cognitive architecture, a subroutine that used to be a man insists that this is what you do. This is civilization. This is what the living do. Nobody eats anything. The food rots. Or it would, if someone didn't replace it before it did. Someone does replace it. The protocols require fresh food. The protocols are followed. This is not presented in the lore as tragedy. It is presented as eccentricity, which is somehow worse. Then there are the ones who broke. The flayed ones started as Necrons who retained enough consciousness to notice what they'd lost. The hunger for organic life, for warmth, for flesh, for the biological reality of a body that could feel things, became pathological. A Citan called Landugor, during the Necron rebellion against the Star Gods, cursed them with the Flayer virus as a parting gift before being obliterated. The virus is a specific kind of genius. It breeds hunger, real, uncontrollable hunger for organic flesh. The infected Necron tears the throat out of a guardsman, shoves the warm meat into a metallic maw, and feels it hit the cold, unyielding floor of a ribcage made of necrodermis. No taste, no fullness, just the sound of wet protein sliding against living metal. They cannot digest anything. They are machines. The flesh does nothing, and yet the hunger doesn't know that. By the time anyone noticed the virus existed, it had spread to 1,000 worlds and dozens of dynasties. You carry it for millennia without symptoms, and then one day you're wearing someone else's face over your skull of living metal, trying to remember what warmth felt like. This is not a fringe condition. This is what happens when the machine remembers it was supposed to be alive. Zarek spent millions of years in the void between galaxies processing this. He is the only Necron who retained complete memory of being organic. The radiation sickness, yes, but also everything else. The weight of a body. The taste of food that actually went somewhere. The specific misery of biological existence and the specific warmth of it that you only notice once it's gone. He drifted alone. For millions of years, processing. His dream, if a machine can be said to dream, is finding an organic species advanced enough to serve as vessels, transfer the Necron consciousness back into biological bodies, end the biotransference, undo what he did, 60 million years, still looking, still failing. When the Necrons finally wake from their tomb sleep and emerge into the 41st millennium, this is what they wake into. A galaxy that barely remembers they existed, bodies of metal that have been lying dormant so long that personality engrams have degraded in most of them. A silent king who has been alone in the void for longer than most civilizations have existed, and the ongoing question of whether what remains is enough to count as survival, or whether it's just the dream of survival running on old hardware. The immortality worked. That part was delivered exactly as promised. Everything else was the fine print. You live forever as a Necron. You wake in the 41st millennium with your memories, your titles, your ancient grudges fully intact, your capacity to feel any of it quietly absent. You reclaim your tomb world. You rebuild your dynasty. You go to war against species that are warm and loud and alive in ways you can no longer access. And somewhere in the programming, Beneath the tactical subroutines and the dynastic protocols and the 60 million years of accumulated nothing, something that used to be a Necrontyr is still trying to figure out what it was you actually gained.